What's the worst thing in the world? Taxes? Dental appointments? No. It's Susan Vaughn, the HOA president of Oakwood Estates, with a $10,000 smile and a heart carved from glacial ice. When she slapped a violation notice on my brand new fishing boat and told me it didn't fit the neighborhood aesthetic, she had no idea she just declared war on the wrong man. She wanted me to remove my boat? Fine. I moved it right in front of her house because by then it was my legal right as the new owner of her property. Let me back up. My name is Logan Pierce. Until 6 months ago, I was living the so-called American dream. Downtown condo, 7-figure software company, espresso machine that cost more than my first car. After 10 years of 80-hour weeks and dinners that came from vending machines, I finally hit the jackpot. A tech giant acquired my startup for more money than I ever imagined. It should have been the happiest moment of my life. But it wasn't. Because my wife, Catherine, wasn't there to see it. She passed away 18 months earlier after a brutal fight, with ovarian cancer, leaving me to raise our 12-year-old daughter Crystal on my own. I don't remember much from those months after Catherine died. Just the silence, the quiet dinners, the way Crystal stopped laughing. The way I buried myself in work, thinking productivity might distract me from the gaping hole in my chest. It didn't. So when the acquisition went through, I decided it was time to stop running. Time to give Crystal and myself a new beginning. Catherine had always dreamed of living in a quiet neighborhood with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and a lake nearby where I could teach Crystal to fish, just like her father had done for her. So I bought that dream. Or so I thought. We moved to Oakwood Estates, a supposedly prestigious community built around a private lake located just outside the city. On the surface, it looked like a postcard: neatly trimmed hedges, cobblestone sidewalks, luxury, SUVs gliding past kids on scooters. The real estate agent handed me a crisp binder of HOA documents and I, like an idiot, skimmed it and signed on the dotted line. That was my first mistake. We moved in early spring. Crystal was quiet, unsure, about starting over. I reassured her. This is our new chapter, it's what Mom would have wanted. The second weekend, I unveiled a surprise, an 18-foot fishing boat, modest but perfect. I'd spent weeks researching models, something safe, simple, and easy for a father and daughter to bond over. When the delivery truck pulled into the driveway and the tarp came off, Crystal's face lit up for the first time in months, painted along the hull in elegant Navy script, Pierce's Piece. Catherine's idea for the boat we never got to buy. Crystal ran her hand across the name and looked up at me. Can we go out this weekend, Dad? You bet, I said. We sat in the boat, still in the driveway, for hours that night. We planned routes across the lake, picked out fishing gear, even practiced tying knots. For the first time since losing, her mother Crystal looked like a child again, full of wonder instead of grief. It was healing, until she showed up. Susan Vaughn, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, mid-40s, designer suit, hair so perfect it could have been sculpted, and eyes colder than January. She pulled into our driveway unannounced in a silver Mercedes, stepped out, and greeted me with a practiced smile that didn't touch her eyes. You must be our newest neighbor, she said, extending a manicured hand. Susan Vaughn, HOA president. I just thought I'd welcome you personally. I shook her hand. She glanced at the boat, then at my cargo shorts, my faded college t-shirt, and finally Crystal, who was sitting inside the boat tracing the name on the side with her finger. That's quite a boat, she said. Perfect for the lake, I'm sure. But of course I assume you know recreational vehicles can't be stored in driveways. It's in Section 8.3 of the Community Covenants. I blinked. It's temporary, just until I move it to the dock this weekend. Her smile tightened like a noose. Well, actually, she said, pulling a thick stack of documents from her purse. There's currently a waiting list for dock space, and as it says here, she flipped to a page and stabbed it with a French manicured nail. No boats, trailers, or recreational vehicles may be visibly stored on any lot at any time. She handed me the paper with theatrical flair. I tried to push back. The real estate agent told me I had lake access. You do, she said, once you reach seniority on the dock list. Until then, I suggest you store your boat off-site. Otherwise, you'll face daily fines. She looked at Crystal again. It would be such a shame for your daughter to be disappointed, but rules are rules, I'm sure you understand. Then she turned, got in her car and drove off, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and the stink of veiled threats in her wake. The next morning, I found a bright orange violation sticker plastered on the side of my boat. Notice of covenant violation, unauthorized vehicle. Remove within 48 hours or incur a fine of $100 a day. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. That evening, another notice, this time for improper garbage bin placement. The day after that, lawn height exceeds acceptable maximum by 0.25 inches. I started to realize this wasn't enforcement. It was harassment. I tried calling the HOA office. No answer. I left messages. No reply. When I finally spoke to someone, they told me Susan was unavailable, but all violations must be corrected immediately to avoid escalating penalties. Crystal could feel the tension. One evening she asked me, "Are we in trouble, Dad?" I forced a smile. "No, sweetheart. We're just adjusting." But inside I was boiling. That night, I found her crying in her room, scrolling through photos of her mother. This neighborhood was supposed to be our new beginning. Instead, it was becoming a prison, with Susan Vaughn as the warden. A week later, Susan called an emergency HOA meeting. Crystal and I went, thinking we could explain ourselves. What we walked into felt like a public execution. Susan stood at the front of the community center with a PowerPoint already queued up. Slide 1, a photo of my boat, time-stamped. Slide 2, my trash bins. Slide 3, the basketball hoop I'd installed for Crystal, also against the rules. Maintaining our property values is our #1 priority, Susan said, staring directly at me. That means enforcing our standards without exception, even for those who are new to our way of life. A few neighbors nodded. She clicked again. Slide 4, a bar graph comparing regulated neighborhoods versus non-compliant ones. She didn't say it out loud, but the implication was crystal clear. I was lowering their property values. That was the moment I realized. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about a boat. This was about control. And she thought I'd just roll over and comply. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The entire neighborhood knew no one was going to force us out. But if Susan wanted to play games, I'd show her how I played. Over the next few weeks, I did my research. I had the boat stored at a marina 20 minutes away and paid the ridiculous fine. I trimmed the lawn to exactly the required height. I even took down Crystal's basketball hoop. I was determined to follow every rule to the letter while I figured out my next move. But Susan wasn't satisfied. New violations appeared almost daily. The color of my mailbox. A bird feeder that attracted nuisance wildlife. Flowers I'd planted that weren't on the approved vegetation list. It was harassment. Plain and simple. Each violation came with a fine. And the fines were adding up. More concerning was the effect on Crystal. She had become quiet and withdrawn again, afraid to do anything that might break a rule. The joy of our new beginning was being systematically crushed under Susan's designer heel. So I started connecting with other homeowners, discreetly. I soon learned I wasn't the only one suffering under Susan's regime. The Wilsons had been fined for their son's wheelchair ramp, which Susan deemed an unapproved modification. They eventually got an exception under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but only after hiring an attorney. The Garcias had been cited for excessive gathering when they hosted a First Communion celebration for their daughter. The pattern was clear. Susan targeted anyone who didn't fit her narrow vision of what the community should look like, using HOA regulations as her weapon. I sought legal advice from Harold, a retired corporate attorney who'd practiced for over 40 years. The problem, he explained, is that HOAs have tremendous power. Courts generally uphold their right to set and enforce rules, even seemingly arbitrary ones. Your best bet is to find procedural violations in how those rules were created or enforced. So I started digging. I attended every HOA meeting, recording everything. I requested all HOA records, minutes, financial statements, anything I could legally access. That's when I met Linda Marshall, the timid but honest 50-year-old HOA secretary. I began meeting with her discreetly at a coffee shop well outside Oakwood. I've worked for 3 HOA presidents before Susan, she told me. None of them were perfect, but Susan, she sees the HOA as her personal kingdom. Linda had been keeping private records of Susan's misconduct. She was afraid to speak up but unwilling to be complicit in the abuse. She changes meeting minutes after I've typed them up, Linda said. She holds unannounced meetings with just her allies. She's even forged signatures on proxy votes to push things through. What I uncovered was shocking. Susan had been selectively enforcing rules against people she deemed undesirable. She held emergency board meetings without proper notice. She altered minutes after they were approved. And most disturbing of all, she was funneling HOA maintenance contracts to companies owned by her friends at inflated prices, likely in exchange for kickbacks. This wasn't just petty tyranny, it was potentially criminal. The landscaping company, that maintained the common areas, owned by her brother-in-law, charging 40% above market rate. The security service, owned by her tennis partner's husband, the pool maintenance firm. It had no other clients and had been incorporated just days before getting the Oakwood contract. Then I uncovered something else, an old regulation. It had been removed from the current rulebook but never properly rescinded according to state law. It allowed boats to be parked in driveways if the owner obtained signatures from 75% of neighbors. So, I went door to door with a petition. But I quickly hit a wall of fear. People listened sympathetically. But when it came time to sign, they glanced nervously up and down the street and made excuses. I'd love to help, but our variance request for a new gazebo is pending. We're trying to sell next year. We can't risk getting on Susan's bad side. A few brave souls did sign, but within days they called to ask me to remove their names. Mysterious violations had suddenly appeared on their own properties. Nancy Greenfield, an elderly widow who lived 3 doors down, was one of the few who stood firm. Susan's been bullying people for years, she told me, her hand shaking slightly as she signed the petition. My husband Bob would have stood up to her if he were still alive. I'll do it for him. The next day, Nancy received a violation notice for the rose trellis that had been in her garden for over 20 years. When I visited to check on her, she was in tears. I can't afford the fines, she admitted. I'm on a fixed income. I'll have to take it down. Meanwhile, Susan launched a full-blown smear campaign against me. Suddenly, rumors spread that I was some kind of troublemaker trying to bring down property values. She even hinted to a few neighbors that my tech company had been involved in questionable practices and that's why I'd sold it. It was character assassination, and it was working. People who had once been friendly now avoided eye contact when I passed. I overheard whispers at the community pool about the nouveau riche disruptor who didn't understand our standards. Even Crystal felt the impact. At school, classmates whose parents lived in Oakwood began excluding her from social events. I was, at my lowest point, seriously considering selling the house at a loss and leaving, when Harold called me over one evening. "Take a look at this," he said, pointing at his screen. It was a private real estate listing. Susan's house, she was selling quietly and quickly. According to Harold's sources, she planned to cash out, move to a more prestigious neighborhood, and leave behind the mess she'd created. She does this, Harold explained. Manipulates the rules to drive out anyone who might oppose her, then sells high and moves on. The listing described Susan's home as a prestigious property in an exclusive, meticulously regulated community with exceptionally high property values. The asking price, nearly $1 million, well above even Oakwood's inflated market. She's going to cash in on the very standards she's been terrorizing everyone about, Harold said bitterly. And whoever buys her house will probably be cut from The same cloth. The cycle will continue. As I stared at the listing for Susan's sprawling colonial, a crazy idea formed in my mind. If Susan thought she could run people's lives and then walk away unscathed, she had no idea what was coming. Called Richard Blackwood, my attorney who had handled the sale of my company. Then I called Aaron Young, a college friend turned successful real estate broker. Together we formulated a plan. Entirely legal, but deliciously devious. You're going to need a shell company, Richard advised. And ironclad paperwork. If you want this to work, everything has to be by the book. Aaron nodded. I'll handle the negotiations. Susan doesn't know me. I can play the part of a wealthy client who values privacy. She'll never suspect a thing. First, we established Oakwood Legacy LLC with me as the silent owner. Richard constructed the legal structure. Airtight, legitimate, and untraceable. Then Aaron reached out to Susan's listing agent, expressing interest on behalf of a discreet high-net-worth client. We made an offer, full asking price, but with conditions, a quick close, minimal inspection, and strict confidentiality. The agent was thrilled. Susan was cautious but intrigued. Aaron's investigation revealed the truth. Despite her designer clothes and luxury car, Susan was drowning in debt. She'd maxed out multiple credit cards, lost heavily in a failed real estate investment. Her second ex-husband had just won a lawsuit reducing his alimony payments, and another property she owned was on the verge of foreclosure. She needed a fast, clean sale. We were offering exactly that. Her entire facade of power and wealth was crumbling under the weight of her own financial recklessness. While the deal progressed, I kept up appearances in Oakwood. I toured homes in other neighborhoods. I even put a for sale by owner sign in my front yard. Susan was ecstatic, telling everyone she'd successfully maintained community standards. At one point, she even stopped by. I hear you're thinking of moving, she said, barely concealing her glee. I hope it's not because of any misunderstandings about our community expectations. I smiled politely. Just a personal decision, I said. We're hoping to find a neighborhood that's a better fit. She practically glowed with triumph. Little did she know, she'd just accepted an offer from my LLC to buy her house, and she had signed a contract granting early access to the buyer for renovation planning. The contract, drafted perfectly by Richard, required the seller to vacate all personal items during this early access period. Contractors would be coming and going. Susan agreed to everything without suspicion. The day before Susan's planned goodbye party for us, yes, she actually organized a party to celebrate driving us out, I received the keys to her house. With the keys in hand, I felt a rush of vindication. This was really happening. I picked up the phone and called the boat transport company. Can you deliver my boat to this new address tomorrow morning? Susan wanted me to remove my boat from my property. Fine. I'd park it in the most poetic place possible, her driveway. I parked my boat right in front of her house, on the most legally appropriate spot possible. After all, that property now belonged to me. Tony, the boat transport driver, was initially confused when I explained what I wanted. Let me get this straight, he said. You want me to deliver your boat to someone else's house? I clarified. It's actually my house now. I showed him the paperwork. His confusion turned into a grin. Man, I've seen some petty neighbor feuds in my time, but this is next level. I'm in. We agreed on an early morning delivery, before most of the neighborhood would be awake. I wanted everything set up before Susan's party. That next day is one I'll never forget. Susan had invited the entire neighborhood to her home for afternoon cocktails and a fond farewell to the Pierces. Though in truth, it was a victory celebration. She believed she'd driven us out. The invitation, which was delivered to every home except ours, described it as a gathering to celebrate our community's continued commitment to excellence. Harold had shown me his copy, shaking his head at the audacity. Meanwhile, Tony and I arrived at Susan's house at sunrise. We positioned my boat right in her circular driveway, perfectly centered, prominently visible from the street. Tony, now thoroughly entertained by the whole situation, helped me set up several large signs around the yard. public property, no dumping. Violators will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and my personal favorite, 7 video surveillance. In progress, by 8:01 a.m. everything was in place. I settled into a lawn chair next to the boat with a thermos of coffee. Then I waited. I'd arranged for Jennifer Lawson, a notary public and longtime friend of my late wife, to attend Susan's party, not as a guest, but as a legal witness. Jennifer had known Catherine since college and had seen firsthand how devastated Crystal and I had been after her death. When I explained everything Susan had been doing to us, Jennifer didn't hesitate. "Catherine would have loved this," she said. "You always played chess while everyone else was playing checkers." As guests began arriving, they were confused by the boat and the signs, but assumed there must be some logical explanation. Susan, inside and utterly unaware, was hosting with her usual flair, champagne flute in hand, laughing with early arrivals. From my seat near the driveway, I could see her through the window, sophisticated, composed, the picture of polished hospitality. That was about to change. Some guests pointed toward the boat. Susan waved them off without even looking, probably, assuming it was a delivery or someone parking poorly. Then she finally stepped outside. The look on her face was worth every headache, every dollar, and every legal document I'd endured. Her expression cycled rapidly. Confusion, then recognition, then shock, and finally pure, undiluted rage. She froze for a moment, taking in the full sight. My boat, in her driveway, surrounded by legal signage. Me, calmly seated next to it with a coffee, waving. Guests whispered among themselves, their murmurs growing. Louder, her smile dropped instantly. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked. "How dare you park that monstrosity on my property? I'm calling the police." Susan whipped out her phone and dialed 911, reporting what she claimed was vandalism and trespassing. I remained calm while Jennifer quietly recorded everything from a discreet distance. "You don't understand," Susan shouted into the phone. "This man has put his hideous boat in my driveway. I need officers here immediately." By now, half the neighborhood was recording the scene. The other half were whispering in disbelief. Crystal had stayed home, with Harold. I didn't want her witnessing this part. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. Susan was in full meltdown mode, screaming at the officers to arrest me and tow the boat. Officer Rodriguez listened patiently, then turned to, "Peacer, can you explain what's happening here?" I handed him a folder containing all the legal documentation. Proof that Oakwood Legacy LLC, which I owned, had legally purchased Susan's property, and that I had contractual access rights even before closing. "I'm simply parking my boat on my own property," I said, "which violates no laws or HOA regulations." The officers reviewed the documents closely. Rodriguez occasionally glanced up at Susan, whose face was now pale with shock. "These appear to be in order." He finally said, "Ma'am, it seems Mr. Pierce owns this property now. It also appears you're hosting a party on his private property without his permission." Susan dropped into a chair, stunned. "This is impossible," she whispered. "This is my house." I stepped forward, holding up a copy of the purchase contract. "Actually, Susan, you sold it to my company last week, and per the terms you signed, I have full access rights starting yesterday." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jennifer, playing her role perfectly, stepped forward and presented additional notarized documents. But I wasn't finished. "Oh, and Susan," I said loudly, addressing everyone, "while you're processing all this, you should know I've also been gathering evidence of your selective rule enforcement, procedural violations, and potential financial misconduct as HOA president." The crowd quieted. Eyes turned sharply in Susan's direction. "I have affidavits from multiple residents detailing harassment, falsified meeting minutes, unauthorized rule changes, and thanks to Linda Marshall, our HOA secretary, I now have the real records." Linda stepped forward with a thick binder. "These records differ significantly from the versions Susan shared with the community," I continued. "And based on what we're uncovering, we may be dealing with criminal behavior." Several board members looked deeply uncomfortable. One woman whispered, "I told you those special assessments didn't add up." Another muttered, So that's why the Patels really moved. Susan's kingdom was crumbling in front of her guests, and she knew it. Her face shifted rapidly. Shock, then fear, and finally calculation. "This is absurd," she announced, her voice rising. "Mr. Pierce clearly obtained this purchase through fraudulent means. I'll have this contract invalidated by tomorrow." She turned to the guests. "The party is postponed until this matter is resolved." People began to file out, whispering to one another. Susan walked over to me and hissed under her breath, "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I have connections with every judge in this county. You'll regret this little stunt." But the next week she learned I'd planned for everything. Susan filed emergency motions to block the sale, claiming fraud, misrepresentation, and duress. She hired a high-profile attorney, but I had retained Laya Torres, a firebrand lawyer who specialized in HOA abuse. Laya tore through every argument. All disclosures were proper. All terms were clear. Ms. Vaughn signed the contract willingly, she stated in court. The fact that she failed to read the fine print, or failed to investigate the buyer, does not constitute fraud. The contract was upheld. The sale was ruled fully legitimate. All procedures had been followed. Meanwhile, I continued living in my original home, with my boat still parked in her driveway, a daily reminder of her downfall. Word spread fast. People who had been afraid to speak out before now shared their stories. The Garcias said Susan tried to block their home purchase because they didn't fit the neighborhood image. The Williams family revealed she threatened them over culturally inappropriate holiday decorations. Nancy Greenfield proudly reinstalled her rose trellis. It was like a spell had been broken. Susan tried to rally support, but the tide had turned. Linda publicly released records showing Susan had manipulated votes, altered rules without quorum, and approved shady contracts with her friends and relatives. Even Claire Wren, a once silent board member, stepped up. She told us it was just streamlining. "When she bypassed the vote," Claire said at an emergency board meeting, "I should have spoken up sooner." Then came the final blow, from the last person anyone expected, her own son. Thomas Vaughn, 22, home from law school, stood up during a heated HOA meeting called by Susan herself. "I can't stay silent anymore," he said, voice shaking. "I've watched my mother manipulate this community for years. I've seen her forge signatures, hold secret meetings, and target families she didn't like. And just like that, Susan Vaughn's empire collapsed. The thief in that the rules were just tools to maintain property values and keep out the riffraff." Susan tried to interrupt him, but Thomas continued, "I'm studying law to help people, not to abuse power like this. I'm sorry it took me so long to speak up." Susan's face was a mask of betrayal and fury. "Thomas, stop this immediately," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." But Thomas stood his ground, producing emails and text messages from his mother that corroborated his claims. "I kept these because I knew someday I'd need to do the right thing," he explained. "I just wish I'd found the courage sooner." The meeting erupted into chaos, board members calling for Susan's immediate resignation and homeowners demanding a full investigation into all HOA finances. After that meeting, Susan's position became untenable. With the closing date approaching and her legal options exhausted, I decided it was time to present her with a choice. I wanted resolution, not endless conflict. I invited her to meet me at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown, with both our attorneys present. She arrived looking haggard, the stress of the past weeks evident in her appearance. Gone was the perfectly coiffed HOA president with the designer wardrobe. In her place was a woman whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around her. So I began once we were seated. "I'm going to offer you two options. Option 1, you can buy back your house from me at a 20% premium over what I paid and sign a legally binding agreement, never to return to Oakwood Estates or serve on any HOA board within the county. Option 2, you can rent your house back from me at double the market rate, subject to a detailed list of tenant regulations I've drafted, including restrictions on paint colors, garden ornaments, and garbage can placement, which I'll be enforcing vigorously." I slid a thick document. Across the table, the rental agreement option. Each page was filled with increasingly absurd restrictions. Garbage cans could only be placed at the curb between 6:07 and 6:13 a.m. on collection days. Exterior lights must be exactly 42 watts. No more, no less. Holiday decorations limited to one wreath, no larger than 8 inches in diameter. My lawn must be cut to exactly 1.5 inches, measured weekly by the landlord. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, mirroring the very rules Susan had weaponized against others. Susan glared at me with undisguised hatred. "This is extortion," she hissed. Laya Torres calmly interjected, "No, it's a settlement offer. And given the potential civil and possibly criminal liability Miss Vaughn faces if the financial irregularities in the HOA books were to be formally investigated, I'd advise my client to consider it carefully." Susan's attorney whispered urgently in her ear. After a moment, Susan's shoulders slumped. "Fine. I'll buy back the house," she muttered. "But this isn't over." I slid the agreement across the table. "It is over, Susan. This document includes a non-disparagement clause and a prohibition on litigation related to these matters. Once you sign it, we'll never have to deal with each other again." Susan signed with trembling hands, her face a mask of barely contained fury. As I watched her sign, I realized what I had accomplished wasn't just personal revenge. I had shifted the balance of power in the entire neighborhood, and I still had one last surprise that would ensure no one like Susan could abuse power in Oakwood Estates again. In the weeks that followed, I led a complete reformation of the HOA, structure and regulations, with Dr. Eleanor Hughes, a 60-year-old property law professor who lived in the neighborhood, but had always kept her distance from the HOA. We drafted new bylaws with clear, unambiguous language. We implemented a recall mechanism that allowed 30% of residents to trigger an immediate vote of no confidence in any board member. We created a transparent financial system with regular audits by an independent firm. We required recordings of all meetings and professional parliamentary procedure. Most importantly, we crafted rules that prioritized community well-being over arbitrary aesthetic standards. The community embraced these changes enthusiastically. People who had never attended an HOA meeting before showed up to contribute ideas. We formed committees focused on different aspects of community life: activities for children, improvements to common areas, welcoming new residents, and supporting elderly neighbors. The atmosphere in Oakwood Estates transformed, from one of fear and rigid conformity to genuine community spirit. Crystal blossomed in this new environment, making friends with neighborhood kids who are now allowed to play basketball in driveways and ride bikes on sidewalks without fear of violation notices. Claire Wren stepped up to run for HOA president on a platform of transparency and inclusivity. She won in a landslide. One of her first official acts was to approve the Rodriguez family's application to purchase a home in Oakwood. The same family Susan had previously rejected through manipulative use of the Architectural Review Committee. The day the Rodriguez family moved in, neighbors organized a welcome party, complete with children playing freely in the street and adults chatting on front lawns that weren't all identical. Harold Winters and other older residents who had been intimidated into silence under Susan's reign found their voices again. When the day came for Susan to move out, having completed the repurchase of her house at a premium that essentially erased my profit, there was no going-away party. No one came to help her load the moving truck. Crystal and I watched from across the street as the last boxes were loaded, and Susan's Mercedes pulled away, never to return. Crystal took my hand. "Dad, can we finally take the boat out on the lake now?" she asked. I smiled, knowing we had finally found a home, a real community. But there was one small detail I hadn't told anyone about Susan, in her old house. A year later, Oakwood Estates had been transformed under Claire's leadership. The HOA had become a tool for building community rather than enforcing conformity. We held regular neighborhood events, established a scholarship fund for underprivileged children in the wider area, and created a mentoring program that paired retirees with local kids for fishing, gardening, and other activities. Crystal had blossomed, making friends and slowly healing from the loss of her mother. The basketball hoop was back up, and neighborhood kids gathered at our house regularly. The rigid, sterile atmosphere that had pervaded Oakwood under Susan's reign had been replaced by a vibrant, diverse community where people actually knew and cared about their neighbors. For the anniversary of the boat incident, as it had come to be known, I organized a community celebration at the lake. We set up tables along the shore with food, games, and music. Nearly every family in Oakwood attended, a far cry from the sparsely attended formal HOA meetings of the past. During my speech, I unveiled my final surprise. I had purchased a small piece of land adjacent to the lake and developed it into a community boat dock, complete with a sign reading, Oakwood Dock, where all boats are welcome. The crowd cheered as I explained that the dock would be open to all residents, no waiting lists, no restrictive rules. Children would have priority on weekends, and we'd be starting a fishing club for interested youngsters. But that wasn't all. I revealed that I had also purchased the house Susan had moved to in her new neighborhood, not to harass her personally, but to convert it into a weekend retreat center for orphan children and struggling families who would never otherwise have the opportunity to experience lakeside vacations. When Catherine was sick, I explained, my voice catching slightly. We talked about what really matters in life. It's not property values or perfect lawns, it's community. It's giving kids chances they might not otherwise have. It's remembering that we're all just passing through, and what matters is how we treat each other along the way. I had elevated my actions from personal revenge to social purpose. The Susan Vaughn Memorial Children's Retreat, named with just a touch of irony, would host its first group the following month. That evening, Crystal and I took the boat out, onto the lake as the sun was setting. We baited our hooks and cast our lines just as Catherine had once taught me to do. After a peaceful hour, Crystal's rod suddenly bent. With my guidance, she reeled in her first fish, a respectable bass that we photographed and released. As we watched it swim away, Crystal whispered, "Mom would be really proud of you, Dad." I pulled her close, thinking of how far we'd come from those dark days after Catherine's death, and how our battle with Susan had ironically helped us heal and find a true home. Sometimes, rules aren't created to protect communities but to serve those who write them. But when you're smart enough to play their game and rewrite the rules when necessary, you don't just reclaim power for yourself. You can change the entire system. And if someone tells you your boat isn't welcome, remember that sometimes the best way to move your boat is to buy the whole dock.